inviting us out today to discuss some ongoing research that has been being conducted. The title of my topic today is Revisiting Double Consciousness, whether it's a myth or a reality. So I'm going to tentatively use my PowerPoint as a point of reference, but the research is dense, so I will eventually fray from what's on the board because it was too much to enclose within the PowerPoint. So on that note, double consciousness we're going to talk about double consciousness. Well, I can just grab a chair and I can sit there and, just get real comfortable with everybody. I like to walk. So, double consciousness is a concept by W.B. Du Bois that was presented in his book, The Souls of Black Folk, published in 1903. W.B. Du Bois is renowned for being a sociologist, a historian, and an author. And he's credited in the field of sociology for developing the concept of double consciousness and second sight. I enclosed a quote from Du Bois's book to familiarize those of you who have not been exposed to this theory before. And it is a quote: "The sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of the world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder." So in 1903, Dr. Du Bois was a graduate from Yale. He went overseas to Europe and studied for a little while. And he was also known for being a proponent of the talented 10. So for those of you who are not familiar with what that concept is, the talented 10 is basically this idea that those in the so-called Negro community, that would be able to attain education would have a better chance of assimilating into the dominant society and would thereby become the leaders of the so-called Negro community. Later on in my speech, I will explain to you all why I use the term so-called to refer to African Americans, blacks, Negroes, Latinos, Indians, etc. The objectives of my research are to revisit the theory of double consciousness for the purpose of identifying its prevalence in 2015, also to address possible correlations between the challenges and conditions facing so-called African Americans in the U.S. and Du Bois' theory of double consciousness. So what we're finding as we're going through the research, a more modified way of looking at double consciousness would just be simply to refer to it as an identity crisis. The identity crisis that's being suffered by those who have been subordinated under slavery and colonization is that there is not a comprehensive understanding of one's history. Nationalities have been removed. True identities were removed through the process of slavery, and the brands of Negro, colored, black, what have you, were put upon by European colonizers as a way to remove nationality and change the discussion of indigeneity to lands in the process of colonization. That was very important for the nations of Europe to commit in the process of colonizing lands in the equatorial climates, because if the discussion was a discussion of indigeneity, it would be difficult to justify the capacity of non-indigenous people controlling and dominating the land, the people, and the resources. So we're finding in the research that we're doing, that this was really the cause and effect and the root cause to why the labels Negro, which was what Spanish and Portuguese slave masters primarily applied to those who were held under the institution of chattel slavery, and black, which was primarily applied by Dutch and British slave masters under the institution of slavery, were put upon. Our additional objectives are to present an additional body of research that detects the presence of double consciousness. We, within that process, are analyzing social constructions of identity, such as Negro, colored, black, some of the things that my colleague from 102, Edgar Campos, addressed, the buck, the coon, the socially constructed identities that have become more commonly known for those of us that are known as black and African American in society. Also to distinguish the relationship between double consciousness and instances of cognitive dissonance, that are present within the dominant culture in this society. So in my research, excuse me for walking across the screen, I found another quote that I thought was important to enclose in a body of research, as well as to introduce the audience to today, because this is something that's discussed very commonly amongst the so-called black community. And in this quote, Du Bois, says in his narrative, quote, "They approach me in a half-hesitant sort of way. I me curiously or compassionate. And then, instead of saying directly, how does it feel to be a problem? They say, I know an excellent colored man in my town. Or, I fought at Mechanicsville. Or, do not these southern outrages make your blood boil? Modern day Missouri. At these I smile or am interested, or reduce the boiling to a simmer, as the occasion may require. To the real question, how does it feel to be a problem? I answer seldom a word." So I'll give you a minute to reflect on that. Because what is to be thought about is that Du Bois wrote this in 1903. And if you look at literature that was conducted through the 30s, through the 40s, through the 50s, through the civil rights movement, this has been an ongoing discussion within the so-called black community. As Edgar referred to in his speech, we are all constantly talking about how we are perceived and received in a dominant society. The need to put on what is more commonly referred to as a code switch. When I walk onto the university campus, in contrast to when I walk down the street on MLK and Oak Park. It's two different faces that I wear. There's two different sets of cultural capital that are valuable in the academic setting in contrast to my hood. What's valuable in the academic setting, they laugh at in my hood. And vice versa. So me on the middle, as one who might qualify as someone who's constantly dealing with double consciousness, I have to find a happy medium. What's real? So this is why we've enclosed the concept of social constructions of identity in our lecture. The questions that arose within this body of research is, based on the listed quote, from 1903 to 2015, what has really changed? If people are still continuing to have these discussions over 100 years later, without, most people in the hood, they don't even know who W.B. Du Bois is, or know that there was a book wrote called The Souls of Black Folk with a term titled double consciousness. They call it discrimination, they call it racism, they call it hating. Nevertheless, whatever term is used, or phraseology is used to discuss these concepts, it still exists, whether knowingly or unknowingly. Is the issue at hand double consciousness or something else? So I found as a student of sociology that there weren't too many so-called black sociologists that were brought up in the body of the literature that we discussed. And one of the individuals that's more prominently known amongst black sociologists is a brother by the name of E. Franklin Frazier, who was a sociologist who obtained his degree in sociology from Howard University. He taught at Atlanta University and also got his master's at Atlanta University and went over to Morehouse College. And the important thing I think about Frazier is that Frazier had more of a grounded perspective in terms of the sociological implications that were facing people who are marginalized in society due to racial concepts. In my interpretation, Du Bois and Frazier are like an old school Martin and Malcolm. You know what I'm saying? Whereas Du Bois had more of a middle class, so-called Negro perspective with his background at Yale, his experience overseas. Frazier never spent time out of the segregated United States. He obtained his degree at Howard University, which is a historically black college. He obtained his master's degree at Atlanta University, which is modern-day Clark, where I happened to attend before I came back to school at Sac State. And then he taught at Morehouse. He's from Baltimore, Maryland, and was raised there his entire life. first book published by Dr. Fraser was titled The Pathology of Race Prejudice in 1927. And the concept that he developed, which somewhat mirrored or was semi-parallel to the concept of the Du Bois double consciousness, was the concept of the Negro complex. And here I just paraphrased Fraser's concept. Dominant society in the U.S. suffers from a Negro complex, quote unquote. The belief that so-called Negroes have a propensity to act on deviant impulses due to inherent tendencies for savage behavior. So this kind of lends over to what my colleague was referring to in these images in modern culture and in a dominant society often perpetuate the buck or the coon or the Jezebel. You know, today we see a lot of depictions of the Jezebel, Love and Hip Hop, Basketball Wives, you know, Beyonce. And I'm not attacking her personally, but we see disproportionate representations of exploited images of indigenous people who are known as blacks and African Americans. And what that stems from, according to Fraser, is the Negro complex. And his concept about the Negro complex was that there's a pathology in the dominant society in America, which is really at